So did you ever ask yourself the question, how did I get here? You can ask that question a couple of different ways, right? You can ask it in kind of a negative way, like, how did things go so wrong that I ended up here? I find myself asking myself that question a great deal lately, but not in a negative way. Because you can also ask that question in a very positive way. In my case, I ask it with a tremendous sense of awe and appreciation. I mean, how did I get to be here? Right, 3 years ago, I had never done this. I'd been in, my ministry had been inside of prisons. I had never been in church ministry ever until 3 years ago, and you guys gave me a shot. And you invited me to be here. And that means more to me than I could ever tell you. Because I can't believe how fortunate I have been for 3 years to be here, to be part of your family, to be able to walk through life with each of you. So again, I kind of asked, how did I get here? Because I feel incredibly blessed and grateful. I feel so blessed to have been able to share so many things together. I was thinking back to our annual meeting in February, and we just kind of ran through all the things we did last year. Our first full year open together, right? We'd been closed for so much of my time here. We got to do such big things together. And I am so blessed to have been part of that with you as we went through that. And I'm just so grateful to have gotten to know so many of you. So many of you have shared really big things with me over these years. And I'm grateful that you've trusted me with that. I'm grateful that you've allowed me to be a part of all that. And I'm sad. I'm sad because today's the final day. And we know that for the health of the church and for the health of all of us, that once I do this, I have to stay away for a time. And that's hard to imagine. But as I kind of look to what's next, and I think about this idea of a transition, I am confident that it is something that God is calling Bonnie and I to do, that there is something He's leading us up to make ourselves available for. I don't know what it is. I know people still don't believe me. I'm not lying. I don't know what it is. I just am confident that God has said, make yourself available and I will give you something to do. So that's what we're doing. I'm truly sorry for the uncertainty it creates for all of you and all this as you go through a transition. And I'd be lying if I didn't say I am nervous. This is scary. It's like, Bonnie was joking. It's like, by noon today, you're retired. I was like, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. I am not retired. But I don't know what God has for us at all. So this will not surprise you that in recent weeks, there have been two words on my mind a great deal: transition and uncertainty. I spent a lot of time thinking about transition and uncertainty. I've said the past few weeks, these past few months, quite honestly. And it occurs to me that God seems to work inside of those sort of things, that God seems to do some of His biggest work in periods of transition and uncertainty. Think through any of the Bible narratives that we commonly talk about, that we commonly hear about, that we have known from the time we were children, if you've been in church since you were a kid. So many of those narratives are filled with times of transition and uncertainty. If we think about things like Abraham, Esther, David, Ruth, the Apostle Paul, right? All of those lives were filled with transitions and uncertainty. And that's just kind of the short list that kind of comes to mind, right? There's a much longer list of all that. And the thing we see over and over again in those stories of transition and uncertainty is that God seems to move in those, that God somehow in those sort of things leads the people in it into a deeper relationship with Himself. And these people often have incredible experiences in their lives. They're not always easy. God never promises it's going to be easy. But He does big things in those times. I mean, if we just kind of run through them, right? Like Esther, right? We were talking about Esther just a few weeks ago, right? Esther, who starts out as an orphan living with her cousin, who rises up to become the queen of Persia, and in that position saves the entire nation that she came from because of that. David, right? David, a young shepherd. David, a kid whose father thought so little of him that when someone came to his father and said, hey, I think one of your kids might be the king, his dad didn't even call him in. His dad left him outside. Literally left him outside to take care of the sheep. And then he rises up to be what is often called the greatest king of Israel. What we do know is that he led Israel through many battles, through many hard times. Think of Ruth. Ruth, a complete outsider, who ends up losing her husband when she's really young. And she's living with her mother-in-law, who then loses her husband and then goes on this long trek to a land that she did not know, to her mother's land, her mother-in-law's land. And she lives actually in poverty for a while until she finds the love of her life. But the bigger part of that is the genealogy of Jesus is spelled out. Ruth ends up being part of that, having started in such a difficult situation. And of course, the reference point for major transitions in life is the Apostle Paul. Right? The Apostle Paul was on the side of attacking Christians and killing Christians. And then he has this epiphany at some point. And he switches over and he starts traveling around his region of the world telling people about Jesus. And this man who was actually setting out to attack and kill Christians ends up writing more of the New Testament than any other single author. God works in times of transition and uncertainty. You know, and I think that when this happens, it can impact all our lives. And I believe that this is an invitation that God still invites us into, that God still invites us to be in transition and uncertainty and to move in those times of transition and uncertainty. And sometimes the way the choice goes is that it's truly an invitation. That God kind of makes you aware that if you'll kind of step forward in this particular way, I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but I'm going to tell you I have a plan. And so you can choose to be part of it or not. That's one way it happens. Other times, the uncertainty itself, the transition itself, just kind of happens. You just kind of find yourself caught up in it through no choice of your own. But that doesn't mean you do not still have a choice. That when we find ourselves in times of transition, in times of uncertainty, we have a choice about how we deal with it. Do we deal with it? Do we just put our head down and wait for it to go by? Or do we say, in this transition, I'm going to do the part that I can to maximize the outcome from this? But in either case, when we choose to be part of it, we get to see God move in our lives in a deeper way. Now, the one thing I do want to be clear about, when I talk about being part of transition or being part of uncertainty, I'm not talking about being reckless. Right? I do not believe that God calls us to be reckless. I don't believe God calls us to be irresponsible. I don't believe God calls us to suddenly abandon some responsibility that we have. Right? If we are in a time of transition, we make sure we give everybody time to work through that. Right? That's what we've tried to do these past several months. But I am certain that God still invites us from time to time to step into adventure. I believe that God does still invite us to step into a journey that we have no idea where it will lead. You know, and I think we see this probably modeled most well in one of the earliest narratives we have from the Bible, which is the narrative of Abraham. Right? Abraham, you may recall we talked about him a little bit earlier this year. I think it was back in January or early February. We talked about Abraham. And when we first meet Abraham, we don't really know much about him. The only thing that kind of makes his narrative a little confusing is his name starts out as Abram and then becomes Abraham later. Same person, just two different names. And when we actually meet up with Abraham, God is asking him to do something. It says, the Lord said to Abraham, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. So as we meet Abraham, he's been given this invitation to just leave everything that gives you certainty. Leave everything that gives you comfort. Leave everything that you're familiar with. And go someplace I'm not going to tell you where it is. So he begins that journey. No idea where it's going to lead. But then God says, when you do that, you'll find something. He says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous. And you will be a blessing to others. Now again, notice, nowhere in there does it say this journey is going to be easy. Nowhere in there does it say that everything's going to go the way you want it to every step of the way. But the promise is that the journey will be worthwhile. You know what? It sounds like a kind of a good deal, right? God says, I will bless you. You'll be famous. I mean, hey, that sounds awesome. But I think the key part of that is that last part there. It says that you will be a blessing to others. I think the benefits that Abraham receives comes from the fact that he's willing to be a blessing to others. And I think that's the thing that God reminds us of, that if we simply pursue things for our own gain and our own purpose and our own comfort and our own wants, we don't get much out of that deal. But when we choose to live our lives as a blessing to others, the other pieces start to come together for us. Now, reading what Abraham is being offered here, we might be tempted to say that, wow, that's a pretty sweet deal. Who wouldn't take that deal? But I think if we stop and think about it, we all understand that someone might really struggle to take that deal. Because part of the deal is uncertainty. Part of the deal is not knowing what's coming up, where you go next. The deal is let go of what's familiar. Let go of what's comfortable. So Abraham had to make a choice. He had to choose to be dependent on God. And it's interesting because I think that much of our lives, we work very hard at not being dependent on God. I don't mean that as condemnation, right? Of course we should be responsible in our lives, right? Of course we should be responsible in the things we do. But there are times where God says, I want you to kind of take a bit of a risk here, right? I want you to step out past your comfort. I want you to do something you can't do by yourself. And when we do that, we have to be dependent on God. That doesn't mean it's not scary. But when we're willing to do that, I think there's something else comes with that invitation. When we're willing to be dependent on God, the invitation allows us to more consciously walk with God because we have to. Right? If I structure my life where I can just take care of everything by myself, I never really need God. Right? But if I'm willing to do bigger things to impact other lives, if you're willing to do bigger things to impact other people's lives, in those times you can't do that by yourself. You have to lean on God, be dependent on God. And that's where our relationship with God, I think, grows the most, which is why it's times of transition and uncertainty where we see God really active in our lives. Now, if you read the full narrative of Abraham, you know that Abraham doesn't get it all right. He makes tons of mistakes. He does some terrible things along the way. Yet God stays with him, continues to walk with him. And Abraham's journey is long. Right? He kind of camps for a while, he travels for a while, he camps for a while, he travels for a while, he camps for a while, he travels for a while. Kind of a lather, rinse, repeat scenario. Right? He kind of goes through that quite a bit. And he experiences some really significant conflicts along the way. And at points he starts to get kind of tired of it. He starts to wonder if any of it really has any value. Like, why does this matter at all? Why am I doing this? And he actually kind of complains to God about it. And the narrative tells us that. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. So even though he got tired, even though he had doubts, he stayed with it. And look at that promise, right? Go count the stars. That's how many descendants you will have. Now, is that hyperbole? Is this kind of an exaggeration, kind of a narrative exaggeration of some sort? I mean, how many stars would he have seen? Do you know how many stars there are? I had to look it up, just so you know. According to scientists, there are around, this is the craziest number, 200 billion trillion stars. In other words, that's a 1 with 22 zeros after it. So that's how many stars there are. So this must be a hyperbole. Or maybe not. Because I'm quite certain that Abraham had no idea that there were 200 billion trillion stars. Because what are the instructions? The instructions are go out, look up in the sky, and count the stars you can see. How many stars do you think he saw? Well, I looked this up too. It turns out, according to scientists, that in ideal conditions, standing on any point on the earth, at most, you can see 5,000 stars at one time. So we'll say Abraham had ideal conditions and he saw 5,000 stars. So how many descendants does he have? Well, I mean, it kind of depends on how you count, right? Are we talking about just his blood relatives? Is that all we're counting? I mean, he went across a lot of generations. That would have been many. But actually, a very large group of people actually consider themselves to be descendants of Abraham. Because Abraham is actually the first patriarch of 3 different religious traditions. In other words, there are 3 religious traditions who consider their tradition beginning with Abraham. There's Judaism, there's Islam, and there's Christianity. Followers of those 3 religious traditions are considered to be descendants of Abraham. In other words, that kind of initial relationship that Abraham had with God began with Abraham and descends down through the rest of us. So how many descendants does he have then? Well, I don't actually know. I don't know the answer across time, but I know what the answer is today. According to Pew Research, today, if you were to add up all the people who are Jewish, all the people who follow Islam, and all the people who follow Christianity, there are 4 billion people alive today that follow those traditions. So that's roughly half the world's population. So we could certainly say that Abraham has at least 4 billion descendants. So it seems that maybe God wasn't exaggerating. Maybe God was using understatement to make his point. Now, of course, none of that's the case. But it's not about the numbers. It's not about the literal numbers. Because when Abraham looked up to those stars, he would have said, this impact is bigger than I can imagine. Yes, that's right. One person's willingness to do what God calls them to do to impact the lives of others will have more than we can imagine. And that's not just Abraham. That's all of us. Right? That one person's step into faith and to be willing to share that faith, to have an others-focused faith, to be willing to do hard things that benefit other people, that will reach farther and farther than we could possibly imagined. Now, if we think about what happened for Abraham, right? He has this kind of experience. He embraces his relationship with God. He grew closer to God. And then his actions and behavior influenced other people, right? And then those people embraced their relationship with God, grew closer to God, and then they shared that with other people who then did the same. And this process continued from person to person across generations. Right? So what we have is the case is that each and every one of those people across all the generations, is that each person who's ever embraced a faith under any of those 3 traditions, who has positively impacted someone else's life, is a descendant of Abraham. And it all started because Abraham was willing to embrace uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, impact other people's lives. So as God extends that invitation to us, because I believe God does continually extend that invitation to us, that we are constantly in situations where, I shouldn't say constantly, we are often in situations where we need to take on a bit of uncertainty. Sometimes it's a bit bigger, sometimes it's a bit smaller. But each time we just embrace our faith to make a difference, we become part of one of those stars in the legacy of Abraham. Right? That was the promise, right? That all those stars were effectively Abraham's legacy. So each person who comes through that is one of those stars. That is why everybody got one of these. I will make sure you remember me, right? Because every time you look at this silly star, you go, ah, that was Jim. Yeah. Actually, it was suggested by Bonnie, but I get credit for everything she does. So there you go. So, but honestly, it's kind of one of those things. I don't know if you guys remember a while back, we passed out stickers where we kind of had a little kind of affirmation that we could put on a mirror. I still have that on my mirror. I love little things like that ground me with God, that ground me with the experiences. And I think that reminders like that, when we're doing difficult things, right? Because you will face uncertainty. At some point in your life, you're going to face uncertainty. And my hope is that in that moment when you're there and you're a bit worried and you're not sure where it's going to go, you'll look at a silly little star with a smile. And you'll go, wow, we talked about this. This is what God does. And I know in this, he's going to be with me. And in this, he's walking with me. And in this, I have a chance to grow closer. So what does it look like when we, as the church, try to live this way, to actually really kind of go forward, kind of sharing our faith this way, kind of being the presence of hope to other people? Well, if you're someone who considers yourself a Christian or a Jesus follower or follows the teachings of Jesus, whatever terminology you might choose, we do get some instructions on where to start from Jesus, actually. So Jesus tells us that, says, therefore go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. So Jesus says, go out there and make a difference, right? Go out and make disciples. In other words, share your faith with people, right? And one of the best ways we share our faith is by being a person filled with hope, right? To live in the hope of what you found and then share that hope with others and demonstrate that hope by being willing to be a very generous, giving person. If you don't have resources, you have time, right? Whatever you have, just be present with people. Live out a life of hope. Demonstrate your hope. And if someone asks you why you have so much hope, be willing to share with them why you have so much hope. And if they ask you more, be willing to share that as well. Now, as we do these sort of things, again, it's not always easy, and sometimes it's scary. And if we head out and we start embarking on kind of new activities and interacting with new people and doing new things, it gets scary. So as Jesus does all this and says all this, he makes a promise. Be sure of this: I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So as you do these things, you're not alone. That God is in with you. Jesus is there with you. It will be challenging if you try to do big things. It will be scary sometimes. But you are not alone. And as we step out to do the things we're called to, we become more and more aware of Jesus' presence with us, of God's presence with us. So we should be bold. Be willing to be bold. I'm not saying be reckless, but be bold. Let's stretch ourselves to make a difference in other people's lives. And if we look at how the first century church, kind of the original church, kind of heard these instructions, and what did they do with it? How did they live out their lives based on these instructions? Well, we get a sense of it from the book of Acts. Right? The book of Acts documents the early church, kind of those first Jesus followers following, after Jesus, sort of thing. And it tells us that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. So the way they interpreted Jesus' instructions starts by being together, right? By being the church, by being in life with one another, right? By actually really being present with one another. And then also, if they look at this, it says they had the apostles' teaching, so they wanted to be grounded in understanding, right? Because the apostles were the ones who were with Jesus, so they would have been the one to teach what Jesus had said. And so they learned those things. They understood those things. They made growing in knowledge and understanding as a church a key part of what they did. It's what we try to do on Sunday mornings. But notice also it says fellowship. They were together. Right? They did more than just get together on Sunday morning. They walked through life with one another. That when someone was dealing with something, we know that through other parts of Acts that they were actually in it with one another. They were supporting each other, picking each other up when they felt down. And it has this breaking of bread. Now that's commonly interpreted to be sharing communion, but other times it's interpreted to mean simply having meals together. So I think that this is kind of a really key validation of, again, going deeply in life with one another. Of course, celebrating communion as we do, but really being together, sitting down with someone who's in a challenging spot and have a meal with them. Because the beauty of having a meal with someone is that it's much easier to have hard conversations, right? Because you have something to do if there's nothing to say. Right? You can have those moments of silence and then share with each other what's going on. And then prayer. Right? They stayed in connection with God. Actively and personally in connection with God. So that's how they saw living out Jesus' instructions. And that's how it remains. That we are together as the church, that we learn together, that we support one another. That we, of course, celebrate communion, but we also are in life with one another. And we try to stay connected to God in prayer. Now, in the earliest days of the church, things kind of went okay. The established religious leadership in the earliest days kind of left them alone. So these Jesus followers were kind of left alone for a time. They were harassed here and there, but largely able to do what they wanted. But then over time, the established religious leadership kind of got sick of them and decided that they kind of need to go. So this kind of wave of attacks started against the church, and they started to actually kind of take out some of the religious leaders. And that created a great deal of uncertainty. Right? Acts tells us, a great wave of persecution began that day, sweeping over the church in Jerusalem. And all the believers except the apostles were scattered through the regions of Judea and Samaria. So all these people who had been in one church together for a time found that some of them got separated, that some of them had to go a different way. Some remained at the original church, and others traveled to new areas. But the key is that both of them faced uncertainty. Right? Both groups of people, the ones who were stayed at the church, the ones who headed out, both had uncertainty. So what did they do? Well, we know from other parts of the New Testament that those who stayed back at the church did what they kept doing. They kept taking care of the church. They kept doing the things that they had always done, that they continued to serve their community. Right? They remained active as a church. They remained active with one another. Even as things had become uncertain, they kept doing what they had always done. But what about the ones who got scattered? What happened to them? Well, it tells us that the believers who were scattered preached the good news about Jesus wherever they went. Other words, even the ones who left took their faith with them, and they shared it with the people they had met. See, this is kind of how it seems to work. Right, that both groups faced uncertainty. Both groups were in situations where they weren't quite sure what the future held. One group was at home and one was in a new place. And they had a choice. They could lay low, play it safe, or they can say, no, we're going to be bold. Right, that those who remained behind continued to push the work hard. Right, those who remained at the church were active as ever, in fact, more active than ever. And the ones that were out chose to be active wherever they landed. And so what ends up happening is that what was one church now becomes multiple churches. That the people who grew together, who studied together, who were together, now continue on in other journeys, but in multiple places. And I believe that what the earliest church people experienced was something truly remarkable. That they now were on separate paths, but somehow they remained on a shared journey. That although they were physically separate from one another, they remained together. Because during the time that they were physically together, something had happened. Right? During the time that they were physically together, a connection had grown. And they had learned from one another. And they'd been changed by one another. And they grew to love one another. And the influence of one was influence on all. And the influence on all was influence to all the others. And so now they were this connected church, even though they were in separate places. And in that, both groups became legacies of Abraham's promise of stars. Those who continue to manage and maintain and care for the church where it was established. And those who headed out were on a shared journey, just on different paths. My friends, that's what I feel today. That I am abundantly sad to be leaving here. But I know that you all have had a huge effect on me, and I have grown to love all you guys. Even though you guys still accuse me of lying about what's going next. I still love you. I still love you a lot. But I do. You guys have been a hugely positive impact on my life. You guys have literally changed my life. Right, this is no exaggeration. Prior to being here, the last time I did this was in a locked prison. I was allowed to leave when I wanted to, right? They kept telling me that anyway, right? Yeah. But no, and to be here with you guys here and the things we've done together is a huge, huge impact on my life. You have literally changed the trajectory of my life. My life will never be the same because of all of you. My hope is I've had a positive impact on some of your life. But as Bonnie and I head out from here, and I swear, we really don't know what we're doing next. Right? As we head out from here, we don't know what we're doing next, but we believe God. We believe God that if you make yourself available, if you feel that deep inside of you, if God is saying, you make yourself available and I will show you what to do, I believe he moves in that. I've seen it before because I've done it before. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying I stepped out in faith once before and suddenly things started to change. And I got to do things, which ultimately led me here, oddly enough. So I'm just trusting that God's got that for us next. And I am certain that this church is strong. You guys have been here for, the church as a whole has been here for 250 plus years, right? But you guys have been together for a long time, doing great ministry for a long time. I am certain that you will do that, and you will take it forward. So I just want to say thank you for allowing me to be here. You took a huge chance with me. You didn't have to do that. And I am more grateful than I could possibly tell you.